Okay. Are we streaming now? Yes. Here we are. All right. Welcome to this review of videos 1 through 10 as we get ready for our big test on these first 20 videos. You'll notice that I'm skipping a couple of videos, so you're only accountable for the material that we cover during this review. There are a couple of videos dealing with China and Buddhism that we're just not going to be able to cover. Otherwise, the test would take forever. Okay. Videos 1 through 10. Okay, there appears to be a massive amount of lag in the stream today, so I won't be asking any questions for live response because it's like a minute or more delay between what I'm saying and what's actually coming through on the stream. Okay. So, videos 1 through 10. We begin, not there. I should get things in order, shouldn't I? Okay, we begin with the age of foraging. That's kind of where things begin with human beings, at least in this viewpoint. You have an age of foraging. And what is foraging? Foraging is gathering food, gathering your food from nature, right? Some of that is true foraging, where you're just going out and searching for whatever you can find, nuts, berries, fruit. But then it's usually combined with hunting because the kind of food that you can find just laying around doesn't normally have a lot of protein in it. So if you want to have protein in your diet, you're also going to have to do some hunting. But hunting is a tricky proposition, especially in a day before iron tools, gunpowder. If all you have is Stone Age technology, then it's a pretty tricky proposition to go out hunting animals. The ones that are not dangerous are very fast and hard to find. And then the ones that are easier to find and have lots of meat on them tend to have very large teeth and claws and will kill you. So how did these foraging humans succeed in getting protein? Well, the most common way to do that was to get fish. And so they would typically live near bodies of water to be able to get their fish. By the way, this account of human history is basically the sort of evolutionary account that you would get from a standard source. But we could talk about how after the flood and after the Tower of Babel, people were scattered throughout the world. And as they were scattered throughout the world, they lost touch with each other and sort of returned to a foraging type lifestyle in most of the world. That's one way that we could explain it within a biblical worldview framework. But anyway, we're not really concerned with doing that. Third question is, what are some of the advantages of foraging that make John Green think that agricultural revolution was a mistake? Well, there is some evidence that it was a healthier diet. If you think about it, if you're getting exercise by going out and pursuing things, and if you're eating a diet that primarily consists of fruit and nuts, and berries, and fish, that's a pretty healthy diet, and you're getting a decent amount of exercise. So it does seem that foraging societies had a healthier diet than early farming societies, where they switched to more of a grain-based diet because grain is what you can grow. And they didn't do quite as much exercise because you didn't have to go out and track down your food, right? Walk long distances for it, go on hunting expeditions, go on fishing trips. And so there is some evidence that the foraging lifestyle may have been a healthier one in terms of diet. The foraging diet tended to leave more time for leisure activities. While farming allows you to have predictable and constant access to food, you have to work for it. And it requires a longer period of time to work to till the ground and sow the seed and pull the weeds and water things and then harvest and then thresh out what you're harvesting. And So it's very, very labor intensive. And so there's less time for leisure activities when you switch to an agricultural diet. Okay, what are the advantages of farming? Well, advantages include a steady supply of food, having a surplus of food, which then can lead to the creation of job specializations, cities, and civilizations. And farming can be practiced all over the world. Pretty much if you're relying on foraging, you're going to be limited to areas where there are nuts and berries and fish. But if you're farming, as long as you have access to some sort of water source, it could be a spring, it could be a river, you can farm almost anywhere in the world. So if you look at an area like Mesopotamia or Egypt, these wouldn't have been very good foraging environments because once you get away from the river itself, there's not that much there naturally in terms of fruit trees or berry bushes or nut trees. All those things were more or less created by the irrigation that came from the rivers. So farming is something you can do much more widely throughout the world. And anytime you have an abundance of food, you now can eat some of it and save some of it. You now can actually have an environment where not everybody has to work for their food. Some people can be doing the farming and other people don't have to be farmers. They can do other things. They can build, they can create, they can govern. And so it allows for the development of civilization. So John Green's not a big fan of farming. He prefers foraging. What does he say are the disadvantages? Well, he says the disadvantages are negatively impacting or changing the environment, the fact that farming was hard work, which also led to the enslavement of others, and arguments that have been made from farming contributing to patriarchy, war, and environmental damage. Most of these arguments really don't have much evidence to support them. The type of farming that was being done in the ancient world is not particularly damaging to the environment. Now, you could argue about farming today being damaging to the environment because of the use of fertilizers that are rich in phosphates and the flow off into bodies of water, which creates algal blooms, which blocks out the sunlight. There are problems with farming today, but farming as it was practiced in the ancient world wasn't really damaging to the environment. And I don't think there's any available evidence to say that farming led to patriarchy versus a hunter-gatherer society. This is something John Green says, and you'll hear people say it, but I think it's more like wishful thinking. They have this idealized view of what a hunter-gatherer society would look like, and they imagine freedom and they imagine equality, and they even go to certain societies in the world today and imagine that that's what they're seeing. But the ones who've actually studied it more closely, with a few rare exceptions, wherever men are stronger and, carrying the weapons, making the weapons, they generally tend to be in power. And that's just a part of ancient societies, widespread. So I think most of John Green's objections to farming just don't hold water. Okay, so after we talked about the agricultural revolution, we moved on to the Indus Valley civilization. And he asked, why were the vast majority of ancient civilizations centered around river valleys? And that's because the areas around the rivers tend to be flat and fertile, and there's lots of water available for irrigation and for transportation. The Indus Valley civilization is located on the west side of what is today India, where you find the Indus and Sarasvati rivers. So this is the Indus Valley. If we look at this map here of ancient civilizations, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of each of these maps, the very bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the area that was the Indus River Valley civilization area, okay? It's these empires we'll talk about later, talking about the Middle Eastern, Mesopotamian-based empires. But on the far right side of each one of these maps, you can see the Indus River Valley. Okay, so why was this a good place to have a civilization? Well, because these rivers flood twice a year, usually around the same time, and with predictable flooding, you get fertile soil, but you also get the possibility of being able to do agriculture. You see, any kind of flooding won't do for agriculture. You have to have predictable flooding. You have to know when the water is coming so that you know when to plant your seeds. You have to know when the water is coming so you can control the floods into irrigation canals and things like that. So predictable flooding is key to any civilization that's going to be flourishing next to a river. And the civilization here, the Indus River Valley civilization, it flourished around the years 3000 to 1750 BC. Okay. So when the Indus River Valley civilization was flourishing, they had amazing cities that were uniformly constructed and designed to catch the wind for natural air conditioning. They had elaborate drainage systems for plumbing and sewage. They had a large public bath that may have been a part of their religious beliefs, but we don't really know much about them. And they had an extensive trade network because there were things that were found that were stamped with different seals that indicated where they came from. Kind of like today you'd see made in China or made in India or made in the USA. They had that in the Indus River Valley civilizations. They knew where their things were coming from. And they apparently were also peaceful because archaeologists have found very little evidence of any warfare or weapons. So that's the Indus River Valley. We don't know that much about them because they didn't have a written language. And so we're guessing based upon what we find in archaeology. All right, Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. Meso, between, Potamia is the rivers. So between the rivers, or the land between the rivers. What two rivers are we talking about? We're talking about the Tigris and the Euphrates. And a series of civilizations grew up around the Mesopotamian area. This is present-day Iraq, and it is the home to the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and later the Persians would take over that area. So why was this area so important? Well, because it also had rivers that would flood, right? So the flooding of the rivers allowed for farming, and it's a big, broad, open plain that's flooded by the rivers. But Mesopotamian society was a little bit unique in that it was an early form of socialism. Basically, the farmers contributed the grain that they grew to the government, and then the government redistributed this grain as wages based upon your occupation. Notice everything was owned and controlled by the government, so there really was no individual freedom. There were no private property rights, and so that would limit the amount of flourishing that could take place within this particular society. All right, one of the most important city-states in Mesopotamia was Uruk, and Uruk was characterized by having a very large ziggurat, which is a steeped temple. This is one of those temples you may have seen pictures of that has the terraced, it looks like a pyramid, only smaller. It has different terraces for different levels, and then maybe little ramps going up where people could walk to the top. These were religious. They probably were modeled after the Tower of Babel or related to the Tower of Babel, the idea of trying to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. And in Uruk, the priests would be very important because the priests would conduct ceremonies, usually involving sacrifice, on the top of those ziggurats, and the priests said that they could appease the angry gods and thus bring the floods in a way that would be beneficial and not in a way that would be harmful. The Mesopotamian gods were very angry, very temperamental, and so the priests had a lot of power in Mesopotamia because they were widely perceived to be the ones who could communicate with these gods and get favor from them and keep them from destroying everybody. We know a lot more about the Mesopotamian civilization than we do about the Indus River Valley civilization. Both civilizations had a written language, but the bottom line is we've been able to figure out the Mesopotamian language, cuneiform, and we haven't been able to figure out the Indus written language. So someday maybe someone will figure out how to read the Indus River Valley language, and when they do, we'll know a lot more about them. But for now, we know a lot more about Mesopotamia because we can read what they wrote. One of the important early leaders that came out of Mesopotamia was Hammurabi. Hammurabi, one of the guys you need to know about for this test. He was the ruler of Babylon. He really is the first important world ruler that you need to know about. He ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC. And what's important about him is what you see in this picture on the right-hand side, and that is he wrote a law code. So this pillar, this metal pillar, has engraved in it the laws of Hammurabi. And so this, as far as we know, was the first written law code. So this is written about 300 years before the law of Moses. And there's some evidence that this written law had influence upon all the civilizations throughout the Near East, including into Egypt. And so Moses may have been familiar with some of these legal principles, including an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which may sound familiar to you, okay? So Hammurabi was a very important and influential guy. By modern standards, his laws were very harsh, like the eye for an eye law, but he was at least interested in having a written law rather than just my word is law. So this is one of the early steps toward the rule of law. And he did establish the principle of being innocent until proven guilty, which is an important principle that I think our society is pretty much forgetting these days. As soon as you're accused, you're thought of as guilty. But the principle established by Hammurabi, and that has endured for almost 4,000 years, is that you are innocent until you are proven guilty. So after the early days of Hammurabi, along came the Assyrians. So when Babylon will rise again under Nebuchadnezzar, that will be called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, because the original Babylonian Empire was the one of Hammurabi. So it's a little bit confusing, but there's a Babylonian and a Neo-Babylonian. And then there's also an Assyrian and a Neo-Assyrian, because after Hammurabi come the Assyrians, and those Assyrians are dominant until about the year 612 when the Babylonians take over. So, why were these large territorial empires so vulnerable to conquest? If you look at this map here, that I've shown you a couple times now, what you have in the top left corner is the Babylonian Empire. So this would be like Nebuchadnezzar's day, right? And so the Assyrian Empire here is that of Sennacherib, the guy who conquered northern Israel and surrounded Jerusalem. Actually, this is the first Babylonian Empire, under Hammurabi. This is the Assyrian Empire. And then later you have an Egyptian Empire. And then this is kind of showing you the conglomeration of empires that kind of begins with the Neo-Babylonian Empire and then becomes the Medo-Persian Empire and then the Persian Empire up to Cyrus the Great. So just to be clear, this is the empire of Hammurabi. This is the empire of the Assyrians who conquered the Babylonians. Sennacherib is probably the most famous ruler of this one, but Tiglath-Pileser II is also there. The Egyptian Empire, this is during that period when Egypt was dominant. And then these are a variety of empires that existed before Cyrus the Great. So the Assyrians were really good at conquering people. They were particularly brutal, and there were two reasons. There was one reason why they were particularly brutal, and then there was another reason why they were good at it. The reason why they were particularly brutal is that it was a key part of their religion. They believed that the best way to appease their god, Ashur, was to conquer other lands, thus expanding the glory and fame of Ashur in the world through military conquest. Does that sound familiar to you at all? That should be making you think about a modern parallel to that. So here's a part of their religion that involves conquering the world to expand the fame of their god. But they were good at it because they had a government system that was based on meritocracy. So a meritocracy is where you get your position because you're good at it, not because you were born into it. So if you wanted to be an Assyrian general, you had to be a good general. And so thus they were the first ones to create a true empire. So you can see the difference between the Babylonians who basically had what we would call a local kingdom, versus the Assyrians, who had a true empire that stretched all the way down to Egypt. Now, the Assyrians were never able to fully conquer Judea. They never were able to overthrow Jerusalem, but they did dominate that whole area, and they did get tribute from Judah. And so the Judeans were vassals. All right. And it was the Assyrians who conquered northern Israel in the year 702, when they, basically the 10 lost tribes of northern Israel, they were lost because the Assyrians conquered them. The Assyrians invented impaling, which is one of the most gruesome practices in history. But they not only conquered their enemies, but they publicly humiliated them. So here's that map again of ancient empires. These maps will help you see what a game changer it was when Alexander the Great came in and really changed the face of empire in the world. For hundreds and hundreds of years, you had empires that were essentially entirely Middle Eastern or entirely Mesopotamian, Nile River Valley, the Fertile Crescent. But then Alexander the Great comes in from Greece, and he expands this empire picture to include part of Europe, because he was from Europe. And then the Romans would later expand that to include much more of Europe. So these are the growths. You can see how empires grow over time, from the Babylonian to the Assyrian to the Neo-Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Persian, and then to the Greek and the Roman. All right, moving on to ancient Egypt. Why is Egypt often the most remembered ancient civilization? It's right on the screen. It's the pyramids. Okay? So what river shaped ancient Egyptian civilization? Why was this river so beneficial? It was the Nile River. And as we've said before, it floods regularly. But the Nile has something else advantageous about it, and that is much of the land of Egypt is so flat, such desert, that the Nile is a very calm and peaceful and easily navigable river. So they were able to transport large quantities of goods up and down the Nile River, much more so than you would find along the Tigris and the Euphrates or along the Indus River Valley. This Nile allowed them to have a stretched out, elongated empire where the people from the north could trade with the people from the south, and you could also quarry stone in the south and float it down river to the north and build those giant pyramids. So the Nile was very important, not only for its regular flooding, but also because it was long, straight, calm, easily navigable. How did Egyptians view the afterlife? Basically as a continuation of life. So you would do all the things you would do in this life and the afterlife, but you had to be buried with anything that you wanted to use. So let's say you wanted to ride a chariot in the afterlife. Well, you would have to be buried with that chariot. Let's say you wanted to have servants in the afterlife. You'd have to be buried with those servants. At times, they actually did bury your servants with you, but then later they came up with these little statues that would represent different aspects of servants, and they would get buried in your tomb with you, and then in the afterlife, those would become real servants. I think that was a rather ingenious invention by the servants to keep themselves from having to be buried with their pharaoh. By the way, the Chinese emperors buried thousands of their servants with them because they had a sort of similar view, but theirs actually required the servants to be buried. So you would continue those things in the afterlife. And that's why, like, when the big tombs were made, not only were they stuffed full of stuff, but then the curses were put on the tombs to say, if you ever plunder this tomb, the wrath of Ra will be upon you, and blah, blah, blah. And the reason for that is that if the stuff was stolen out of the tomb, then it kind of disappeared from your use in the afterlife. So you could be riding along in your chariot in the afterlife, and all of a sudden, boom, you're flat on the ground. You're like, where'd my chariot go? It's because somebody took it out of your tomb. It's kind of weird, huh? But that was their view of the afterlife. So Egyptian history is divided into three kingdoms: old, middle, and new. You don't need to know these exact dates, but you do need to know rough dates. Okay, so Old Kingdom, 2600s to 2100s BC. Middle Kingdom, middle 2000s to 1600s BC, and then New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BC. The gap between the Middle and the New Kingdom helps to explain in the Bible when Israel goes down into Egypt, and then later a Pharaoh arises who doesn't know anything about Joseph. How could that happen? Well, Joseph and Jacob and the patriarchs went down into Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, during that 2040 to 1640 time period. So Joseph was prime minister of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. But then later, the Exodus happens during the New Kingdom. When the new pharaohs come in, it's a whole new dynasty. It's really a whole new culture. And there's been 100 years of turmoil and unrest in between. So it was during those 100 years of turmoil and unrest that the Jewish people grew to be large and numerous within the land. And so when the New Kingdom came in, they were seen to be kind of a threat, and they were eventually made into slaves. And then in the 1440s, they did the Exodus thing. What is a pharaoh? Well, the pharaoh is the king of Egypt, right? He's the ruler over Egypt. He's considered to be sort of a god, man, person, an incarnation of the gods ruling over Egypt. And what were the pyramids? They still stand there today. They're the reason why we remember Egypt. Well, they're tombs. They're giant tombs in which the pharaohs were buried. Sometimes leading priests and government officials could also be buried in tombs, but they were basically giant, elaborate tombs. So it's interesting that the most remarkable accomplishments of ancient Egypt were tombs. They didn't serve any function or purpose to help the living. They required massive slave labor to be built, and they were plundered soon after the death of the pharaoh. Almost all the tombs of the pharaohs were plundered hundreds and hundreds of years before. The discovery of King Tut's tomb was so remarkable because we finally found an unplundered tomb. And Tutankhamun was a relatively minor pharaoh, but somehow his tomb was spared being plundered for all those centuries when it was uncovered. Okay, here we go. Got it. Moving on to the Persians. Who was Cyrus the Great, and why was he so great? King Cyrus the Great founded the Achaemenid dynasty in 539 BC, and he conquered most of Mesopotamia. He also freed the Jews from their Babylonian captivity and allowed them to return to their homeland. So he's the founder of the Persian Empire, which initially, there was a Persian and a Median, so it was a Medo-Persian Empire. The green on here is Persian, and the yellow on here is the Median. So the Medes and the Persians, remember the reference from King Darius, who was actually the second king. He said, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, this was a hybrid empire that later just became the Persian Empire. Why was the Persian ruler known as King of Kings? Well, just like in the story of Daniel in the lion's den, Darius is the second king. And we know he is because he promises to make Daniel the third ruler in his kingdom. I think I got that right. Anyway, so he is a little bit of a lesser king. All right, Zoroastrianism. This is a very controversial topic, Zoroastrianism. Like John Green says, it might be the oldest form of monotheism in the world. Well, we know it's definitely not, because Zoroastrianism dates from about the mid-600s BC, and Hebrew monotheism goes back at least to the Exodus in 1440s and the law of Moses. So Hebrew monotheism outdates Zoroastrian monotheism by hundreds and hundreds of years. It does have, rare among the ancient world, the one creator under Zoroastrianism is all good. Evil never comes from him. Most ancient religions had gods who were a mixture of good and evil, and sometimes they did good and sometimes they did evil, and they fought with each other. But here in Zoroastrianism, you have a god who is all good and no evil comes from him. And it was also the first religion to outlaw slavery. Some scholars have speculated that Zoroastrianism, as it's found in its Persian form, was heavily influenced and shaped by the Jewish exiles who had been in Babylon and in Medo-Persia. And even Daniel, who was a high-ranking court official, may have influenced the shaping of Zoroastrianism. But that's a question we can't really know the answer to. It's just kind of interesting speculation to think about. All right, the Greeks. What are some of the major accomplishments of the ancient Greeks? Well, the ancient Greeks are the founders of Western culture. So we get architecture, philosophy, literature, poetry, music, science, mathematics, and politics. All those things that we think of as being part of our culture can all be traced back in an unbroken line to the ancient Greeks. So I'd say they're pretty important. This is one of the most irritating videos to me because John Green kept kind of making light of the Greeks and pretending like they weren't really that important, and maybe the Persians weren't really that bad in the Persian Wars. I found that to be very annoying because everything that we have as a culture can be traced back to the ancient Greeks, and there's a lot of good stuff there. Now, the Greeks were not without their faults, certainly, but Greece gave the West our first history with Herodotus and the first democracy in Athens. In the 4th century BC, that's the golden age of ancient Greece, the building of the Parthenon. The Greeks were divided into a collection of city-states that were fiercely independent. And the governments of these city-states ranged from direct democracy in Athens to monarchies and dictatorships. Now, the majority of them were democracies like Athens, because Athens was not just one democracy, it was a leading and a model city, and so other cities created democracies too. Now, democracy does not automatically create justice. This is one of the questions I asked you on an earlier test. Democracy itself just takes governing out of the hands of one person or a group of people and puts it in the hands of all the people. Well, in this case, all of the free men. So slaves couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. So there's no guarantee that that's going to result in justice, because mob psychology and mob violence can and did regularly lead to injustice, like the execution of Socrates, like the slaughter of the Melians. So democracy is no guarantee of justice. You need the rule of law that limits the power of any one group of people, including the people themselves. All right, so you did have these powerful city-states, but you should also know that the Greeks owned a ton of slaves and treated women poorly. In fact, the Greeks were probably, some historians would say, that they're responsible for the creation of the first truly slave society, which means that they had such large populations of slaves that their society was entirely dependent upon the labor of slaves, and that may be true. So how did the Persian Wars change Greece? Well, when the Persians invaded, they were this incredibly large and powerful foreign empire, and the Greeks had to protect themselves. The Greeks had superior arms and tactics, but they had far fewer numbers, and so they had to band together. They banded together under the leadership of Athens and Sparta, but Athens even more so taking the lead in that. And so as a result, after the Persian War, Greeks began to think of themselves for the first time truly as Greeks, and not just as Athenians or Spartans or Corinthians. For the first time it was, we are the Greeks. And it's interesting how a common enemy can create a sense of unity and a sense of identity. So after the Persian Wars, because Athens was the leading power, leading Greece to victory over Persia, Athens became kind of the de facto capital of Greece. In fact, during the war, Athens had formed this thing called the Delian League. And the Delian League, some historians call it the Athenian League, because what happened is after the war was over, they didn't give up their league, they kept it, but now they used it to advance Athenian interests within Greece, including, trying to take over and exercise power over the Spartans. And the Spartans didn't like that very much. They resented that because they were also very powerful. And so this rivalry led to the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnese is the reference to Greece. Greece is a Peloponnese. It's a series of peninsulas and islands clustered together. And so the Peloponnesian War is the civil war that tore apart Greece when the Delian League, led by Athens, fought against the Spartan League, led by Sparta. At the end of it all, Athens was defeated by Sparta. During that conflict, the people of Milos did not want to fight on Athens' side. They wanted to remain independent. Well, the Athenians voted to kill all the men of Milos and enslave all the women and children. This began a tradition that would later be carried out by Alexander the Great and by the Romans, not every time, but when you ran into a particularly difficult and stubborn opponent and you had to conquer them at great cost to yourself, the tradition became established that you would kill all the men within that city or within that culture, and then you would take all the women and children as slaves. That really continued for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years until, I would say, the Renaissance era. Because even during the Crusades, which we'll talk about next week, that was still the tradition being carried out. Okay, our next big important ruler for you to know about is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was the one he came from Macedon, which was really to the north of Greece itself. So Athens and Sparta kind of fighting with each other down there in Lower Greece. They were sort of at loggerheads with each other and dividing up Lower Greece. And meanwhile, to the north in Macedonia, Philip of Macedon was able to create this unified, powerful kingdom. He took some of the military tactics that the Athenians had developed in their war against the Persians and that the Athenians and Spartans had developed in the Peloponnesian War. He took those military tactics and kind of raised them to the next level. And so he had the most powerful army. He dies. He gives the kingdom to his son Alexander, and Alexander swoops down on the Greeks, conquers the whole Greek Peloponnesus, and then sweeps out over the then known world. He creates an empire that dwarfs any empire that had ever been before him. His army is unstoppable. He never loses a battle. And he takes his empire all the way over to the Indus River Valley civilizations. This is something that no other emperor of any of these previous empires was able to do. So you look at the difference between all of these empires and where they stop, particularly to the east. The Medians got close, but they didn't get all the way over there. And then you get to Alexander the Great and his empire, and it goes all the way to and through the Indus River Valley. And he basically stops then because he's tired and his men are tired. They never lost a battle. And then he dies at the age of 32. So I am one who thinks that Alexander the Great was great and that he deserves the title of Alexander the Great, not because he was a good guy necessarily. He believed in power. He believed in conquering. He was not someone you'd want to have to deal with. But he certainly had superior military tactics and ambition. And much of the fault that's laid upon him, that he didn't prepare for his succession, he didn't build an empire well, he died at the age of 32. People didn't die at the age of 32 very much, even in the ancient world. And so that was an incredibly young death, unexpected death. And so he didn't have time to really create some sort of succession plan. And so he died. His empire was divided up into 3 and then 4 pieces, and sort of some of them were strong and some of them were not as strong. But the weakening of the Greek Empire in the east would later pave the way for the rise of Rome. All right, let's talk about Rome. And this will be the last thing we talk about in class today. Rome had three distinct classes of people. Two of them were considered people. One of them was considered property. They were the patricians, the plebeians, and the slaves. The patricians are pictured on the left on your screen. You see them dressed very nicely. The plebeians are pictured on your right, and then there's a slave with a Roman soldier in the middle. And many Roman soldiers were also slaves. So you had patricians, plebeians, and slaves. Now, the Roman senators were chosen from the patrician class because they were the ones who owned land, they were the ones who had power, and they were interested in protecting their own land and power. The Roman Senate had the responsibility of passing laws and of electing consuls. And so this was a rule of law society. As it started out in the Roman Republic, there was a group of senators. They had power to make laws. They were the ones who appointed the consuls. The consuls, there were two of them. And the reason why they had two of them was twofold. One is they didn't want one person having absolute power, so they had two consuls so that there would be a division of power. But also that division of power was domestic and foreign relations. So one was the domestic president and the other was the foreign relations president, we could say, consul. Well, they were also supposed to serve a one-year term, and then after they served that one-year term, they had to step down and could not be reelected for 10 years. So there were checks and balances, there was a rule of law, there was an active Senate. These are all the things that we inherited from Rome that are part of our government today. From time to time, though, Rome found it was necessary to have a dictator. And the purpose of the dictator was to unite all of Rome under one person's absolute rule when Rome was threatened by some great outside force. The model good dictator was a guy named Cincinnatus. Cincinnati, Ohio is named after him. But Cincinnatus was already retired from his role in government as a general. He was called out of retirement and made a dictator. And then when he finished the job that he was given, he voluntarily retired and returned to his farm. George Washington modeled himself intentionally after Cincinnatus, and there was a group of Washington admirers of people who served in leading positions in the Revolutionary War Army, and they were called the Society of Cincinnatus. So that was the Roman Republic, the way it was supposed to operate. Along came some people over the years, though, who bent the rules, who stretched things a little bit, who stayed in power longer than they were supposed to. As Rome expanded into more of an empire, governors and generals out on the frontiers of the empire become more and more important because there's this expansionist mindset within Rome. And so who's fighting our war on the frontier? Who's conquering the new lands? These people become very important to us. We can see some of that in America, in that we still kind of have this, the people who are fighting our foreign wars. So in the first Gulf War, which took place in 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf was the general on the ground in Iraq, and Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So these two guys became the face of the military during this war, Schwarzkopf and Powell. Now, Colin Powell ended up becoming Secretary of State under George W. Bush. He was asked to run for president. Many people would have loved to see Norman Schwarzkopf run for political office and become president. For a while, General David Petraeus during the Second Gulf War and the Afghanistan War was very popular. And so we still see this. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, after World War II, he was the leader of Allied forces in World War II. He became president of the United States. So this idea that an empire becomes led by generals and governors is not such a far stretch when we think, not that America's an empire, but we see the same thing in our own history. So Julius Caesar was born into a patrician family. He served in the army and in the Senate, and he was a very powerful general and the governor of Spain. So he had a lot of power, and he wanted to be consul. So he ends up forming this triumvirate. And this was the big change. The formation of a triumvirate, I think, is the big critical change from republic to empire. Now, both John Green and Rodney Stark minimize the role that Julius Caesar plays in moving Rome from a republic to an empire. I think his role was critical. I'm not saying that before Julius Caesar, Rome was a pure republic. It had already become a bit of an empire. It was certainly expansionist, but it was still governed by the Senate and by the rule of law, and the consuls still had limited terms, and the balance of power was still a little bit more preserved. Julius Caesar and the formation of the first triumvirate is incredibly important for seeing the balance of power tip from the hands of the Senate to the hands of an absolute ruler. So this first triumvirate is made up of Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. They were the first triumvirate. Each needed the other's support in order to gain control of the Roman government, because Caesar was a very popular general. He was a great orator. He was very popular with the people. So he was sort of your populist general. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, and Pompey, who was also a general, was also very powerful. He had a very large military force that he controlled. When Crassus died in battle, Pompey maneuvered to take control of Rome for himself. Sort of, there's a triumvirate, there's three people, one of the three people dies. It's natural that if you have three people and one of the three people dies, there's going to be kind of a battle struggle for power between the other two, right? Well, Pompey starts sort of asserting himself to get power, and Caesar doesn't like this at all, and so he returns to Rome. The Rubicon River was the boundary between the area that he controlled and the area that was in Rome itself. And thus, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, this is a very important phrase in history, crossing the Rubicon. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he was declaring war on Rome, which meant declaring war on Pompey and the Senate. This is kind of a picture of how the triumvirate was divided. If you can picture the red part belonging to Julius Caesar and the green part belonging to Pompey, and then the purple part belonging to Crassus, who was wealthy in Rome, and then Crassus dies, and so Pompey takes over Rome, and then Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon. That boundary between the red and the purple is the Rubicon River. This is actually the way it was set up after Caesar's death, which we'll get to in a minute, but it's the same basic boundaries. So it gives you an idea if you could think of red as Caesar and green as Pompey, and then Crassus in the middle holding Rome kind of was the buffer, I guess, between the two of them. And when he died and Pompey moves in to take over, well, then Caesar can't really just sit by and let that happen. So eventually Pompey is defeated, he flees, and Caesar becomes both dictator and consul of Rome. There have been dictators before, but the dictator was a different person than a consul. Caesar says, I'm the only consul and I'm the dictator, which means basically I have absolute power. Pompey had fled to Egypt, and Caesar chased him there in order to kill him. But one of the co-rulers of Egypt, a guy named Ptolemy, had already had his people kill Pompey first. So Ptolemy had Pompey killed. Caesar thus supported Ptolemy's sister wife, Cleopatra, in their power struggle for the control of Egypt. Yes, I said sister wife. In their power struggle for the control of Egypt. Cleopatra became the last pharaoh of Egypt, and after Julius Caesar's death, and there was another power struggle, she ends up siding with Mark Antony during the second triumvirate, and she ends up dying. She commits suicide, but she ends up basically dying because she picks the wrong side in a future power struggle. But initially, her and her brother's decision to have Ptolemy killed is what let her be pharaoh in the first place. So after Julius Caesar becomes the consul and dictator of Rome, he actually puts into place several reforms that the people like. He's a populist. Excuse me. He's for the soldiers, and he's for the ordinary people of Rome. Does that sound familiar at all? A power-hungry, populist leader who is for the soldiers and for the common man should sound familiar, should trigger a modern parallel. So he does these reforms. He provides land for pensions for soldiers. He restructures the debts of ordinary citizens of Rome. And he also changes the calendar to look like the one that we use today. A lot like the one that we use today, anyway. And so what happened to Caesar? Well, the Senate resented the fact that their power had been taken away. And so the 23 senators got together, and on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, the Roman Senate assassinates Caesar. Each senator stabbed Caesar one time so that he was killed equally by all the members of the Senate. Now, the Roman Senate initially was hoping that power would come back to them. These 23 men were not necessarily selfless servants of the public good. They wanted the power back in their hands, which would have been a good thing because it would have helped to reestablish the rule of law and checks and balances. But what ends up happening is that the people saw what quick and effective reforms could be brought about by a single ruler, and so they pushed for the reestablishment of a triumvirate. So Caesar was killed in 44 BC. 7 years later, in 37 BC, this is set up, another triumvirate. And initially, this triumvirate doesn't involve Octavian, who becomes Caesar Augustus. This involves 3 other guys. But this reestablishment of the concept of a triumvirate paves the way for what we call the second triumvirate. The second triumvirate had Mark Antony, who was Caesar's best friend and a general, Octavian, who was Caesar's nephew and adopted son, and Lepidus, who is the guy who's always forgotten. You ask people about the second triumvirate and they know anything about Roman history. If you would have asked me a month ago, second triumvirate, I would have said, oh yeah, that was Octavian who became Caesar Augustus and his battle against Mark Antony. And Lepidus kind of gets left out in the cold. So they fought over the power, and Octavian won. Octavian won, and when he won, he named himself Augustus because he was such a humble guy. Augustus means the revered one, and he took that title for himself, and actually all subsequent Caesars took the name Augustus for themselves as well. So then, once he becomes emperor, that's it. Story over. We now have a full-blown empire, and the Senate has just become a rubber stamp for approving his policies. Okay, we are out of time, and we're going to have to just close class. So that's what you need to know from the first 10 videos. I'm going to put these slides up on Schoology. I'll put them up as a PowerPoint and also as PDFs so that you can have this information that's written down. But you notice not every question has a written answer within the slide, so you do need to be paying attention to the presentation, or you can honestly just go and get the crash course curriculum. Okay, so this is what you need to know from the first 10 videos. Next week, we will cover the next 10 videos. And I will see you all in class on Thursday.